The small police station buzzed with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, officers chatting, and papers shuffling across desks. Officer Ben Carter leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It had been a long day, and the weight of the job seemed heavier than usual. He missed his days off, especially since they meant more time with his family. Balancing the demands of being a cop and a father wasn't easy, but Ben did his best to make it work. As he stared at the clock, counting the minutes until the end of his shift, the station's emergency line lit up. The dispatcher's voice crackled across the room, 911, what's your emergency? On the other end of the line, a young voice trembled. Help. I'm scared. Someone's in the house. The boy sounded no older than 7 or 8, his words rushed and filled with panic. Ben's ears perked up. Something about the voice tugged at his memory, but he couldn't place it. He instinctively stepped closer to the dispatcher's desk, straining to hear. Where are you, sweetheart? The dispatcher asked gently, trying to calm the child down. I'm hiding under the bed, the boy whispered, his voice quivering. Please hurry. I think he's looking for me. Ben felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard countless emergency calls during his career, but something about this one unsettled him. The boy's fear was palpable, and his voice seemed familiar. Too familiar. What's your name? The dispatcher continued, her tone steady. There was a pause. Ethan, the boy finally said. Ben froze. His heart skipped a beat. Ethan was his son's name. It was probably just a coincidence. Ethan was a common name, but the similarity was enough to make his stomach twist. Ethan, can you tell me your address? The dispatcher asked. The boy hesitated, his breathing shallow and uneven. Finally, he whispered an address that sent Ben's world spinning. It was his house. His house. His son. Without waiting for permission, Ben grabbed his keys and bolted toward the door. That's my son, he shouted over his shoulder, his voice breaking. His fellow officers exchanged startled looks before one of them quickly followed. Adrenaline pumped through Ben's veins as he sped through the streets, sirens wailing. His mind raced with questions. What was happening? How had this happened? Was Ethan safe? He could barely keep his hands steady on the wheel. Every second felt like an eternity. When he pulled into his driveway, the house was eerily quiet. No lights, no movement. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he drew his gun and stepped inside, his partner close behind. Ethan? Ben called out, his voice trembling despite his efforts to stay calm. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from upstairs, he heard it, a faint shuffle, followed by a muffled cry. Ben's stomach dropped. He darted up the stairs, his mind a blur of fear and determination. As he reached Ethan's bedroom door, he hesitated for a fraction of a second before pushing it open. What he saw stopped him cold. The room was dimly lit, with shadows stretching across the walls from the street lamp outside. Ethan's bed was rumpled, the sheets half pulled to the floor, but the boy was nowhere in sight. Ben's breath caught in his throat as his eyes darted around the room. A faint whimper came from beneath the bed, and he dropped to his knees, lifting the edge of the comforter. There he was, Ethan, curled up, clutching a small stuffed bear to his chest. His tear-streaked face lit up the moment he saw his father. "Daddy," he gasped, his voice shaky but filled with relief. Ben reached out, his hands trembling. "It's okay, buddy. I'm here. You're safe now." He pulled Ethan into his arms, holding him tightly as if letting go might make him disappear. But the moment of relief was fleeting. Ethan grabbed the front of Ben's uniform and whispered urgently, "He's still here, Daddy. He's in the house." Ben's blood ran cold. His partner, Officer Jenkins, had stayed by the doorway, his gun drawn, scanning the hallway. Ben met his eyes, and they exchanged a silent understanding. Whoever had invaded the house wasn't gone. They were still here. "Stay with Jenkins," Ben whispered to Ethan, gently passing him to the other officer. Ethan clung to his father's sleeve, his wide eyes pleading. "I'll be right back, okay? I promise." Ethan nodded reluctantly, his small fingers loosening their grip. Jenkins crouched down, speaking softly to the boy, trying to keep him calm. Ben moved silently down the hallway, every nerve in his body on high alert. The creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his boots echoed like thunder in his ears. He cleared each room methodically, his gun steady, his breath slow and controlled. The bathroom was empty. So was the guest room. But when he reached the master bedroom, the door was slightly ajar, just like the front door had been. A faint shadow moved across the crack, and Ben's heart raced. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his gun, stepping inside with deliberate precision. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the moon illuminated the figure standing near the window. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie, was rifling through the dresser drawers. "Please. Hands up," Ben commanded, his voice firm and unwavering. The man froze for a split second before turning to face Ben. His face was obscured by the hood, but the glint of something metallic in his hand caught Ben's eye. A knife. "Drop the weapon." Ben barked, his finger tightening on the trigger. The intruder didn't comply. Instead, he lunged toward Ben, the knife flashing in the dim light. Ben reacted instinctively, stepping back and firing a single shot. The deafening crack of the gun echoed through the house. The man collapsed to the floor, the knife clattering beside him. Ben quickly kicked the weapon away and knelt to check the man's pulse. He was alive but unconscious, the bullet having struck his shoulder. Jenkins appeared moments later, holding Ethan tightly, the boy's face buried in his chest to shield him from the scene. "I've got him," Jenkins said, motioning to the intruder. "Take care of your kid." Ben nodded, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. He scooped Ethan into his arms, holding him close as he carried him downstairs and out to the front yard, away from the chaos. "I was so scared, Daddy," Ethan whispered, his small hands gripping the collar of Ben's uniform. "I know, buddy," Ben replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's over now. You're safe. I'm here." The sound of sirens filled the air as backup arrived, their flashing lights painting the quiet neighborhood in hues of red and blue. Ben sat on the edge of the curb, holding Ethan tightly, unwilling to let go. But even as relief began to settle in, questions swirled in his mind. Who was this man? Why had he broken into their home? And how had he known they would be vulnerable tonight? Ben looked down at his son, who had fallen asleep in his arms, his small face finally peaceful. Whatever the answers were, Ben knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not yet. The night seemed colder now, though the air hadn't changed. Ben sat on the curb, still clutching Ethan in his arms, his eyes fixed on the flashing lights of the police cruisers parked haphazardly in front of his house. The other officers moved around with practiced efficiency, cordoning off the area, speaking into radios, and preparing to take the intruder into custody. Yet, amidst all the movement, Ben felt stuck, trapped in the stillness of his thoughts. How had it come to this? Just hours ago, everything had been normal. Routine. He'd dropped Ethan off at school, kissed his wife, Lisa, goodbye, and headed to work like any other day. There was no warning, no sign that danger was lurking, waiting to strike at the heart of his family. And now, his son was trembling in his arms, his safe little world shattered by a man they didn't even know. Lisa arrived minutes later, her car screeching to a halt just outside the police tape. She bolted from the driver's seat, her face pale with panic. "Ethan. Ben. What's going on?" Ben stood, cradling Ethan as he walked toward her. The sight of her husband and son alive, though shaken, brought tears to her eyes. She wrapped them both in a desperate embrace, her hands running through Ethan's hair as if to reassure herself that he was truly there. "We're okay," Ben murmured, though the words felt hollow. Were they? Could. Calling for help instead of freezing in fear. And then he thought about the intruder, about the calculated way he moved through their home. This wasn't random. It couldn't be. As he stood there, the pieces of the night slowly falling into place, one thought kept repeating in his mind, a chilling realization he couldn't shake. Whoever that man was, he hadn't come to steal. He had come for them. Ben stepped back inside the house, his mind still racing. Lisa was sitting on the couch with Ethan curled up beside her, his head resting on her lap. She ran her fingers gently through his hair, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and worry. Megan handed her a cup of tea and whispered something that Ben couldn't hear, but he could see Lisa nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan looked up when Ben entered. "Daddy," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "Why did that man come to our house? What did he want?" Ben crouched down in front of him, placing a hand on his son's knee. He wanted to tell him everything was fine, that it was all over, but the words felt like lies. Instead, he said, "I don't know yet, buddy. But I promise I'll figure it out. You don't have to be scared anymore. I'll keep you safe." Ethan nodded, but his eyes lingered on his father's, searching for reassurance. Ben hated the look of doubt and fear in his son's eyes, feelings a child his age should never have to know. He stood and looked at Lisa, who was watching him intently. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked her. She gently eased Ethan off her lap, and Megan quickly stepped in, offering to distract him with a game on her phone. Lisa followed Ben into the small kitchen, crossing her arms as she leaned against the counter. "What's going on, Ben?" she asked, her voice low but tense. "That man didn't just pick our house at random, did he?" Ben rubbed the back of his neck, unsure how much to say. "I don't know for sure, but it doesn't feel random. Jenkins said they found a list on the guy, names and numbers. We don't know what it means yet, but it could be connected to us." Lisa's face paled. "Connected how? Through your work? Did someone you asked come after us?" "Maybe," Ben admitted, though the thought made his stomach twist. "But there's something else. Ethan said the man was looking for something. He wasn't just there to hurt us or take anything valuable. He had a purpose." Lisa's brow furrowed. "But what could he possibly want?" "There's nothing in the house that—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening. "Wait. You don't think this has anything to do with your dad's old stuff, do you?" Ben froze. His father's belongings. They were stored in a trunk in the attic, untouched since his death 5 years ago. His dad had been a private investigator, a man with a knack for uncovering secrets and digging into dangerous territory. "He honestly say that after what had just happened?" Lisa pulled back slightly, her tearful eyes locking onto his. "Who was that man? Why was he here?" "Ben, what's going on?" "I don't know," Ben admitted, his voice heavy with frustration and guilt. "I'll find out, but right now, I just need to know you're both safe." Lisa nodded, though her hands trembled as she reached for Ethan. The boy stirred, opening his eyes slowly. When he saw his mother, he flung his arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder. "Mommy, he was in the house," Ethan whispered. "He was looking for something." Lisa's gaze darted to Ben, fear etched across her face. "Looking for what?" Ben shook his head. That was the question he couldn't answer, the one gnawing at him as he replayed the night's events in his mind. The intruder hadn't been some desperate thief looking for quick cash. The way he moves through the house, the rooms he targeted, it was too deliberate. He had a purpose. A reason. But what could it be? The lead detective, a seasoned officer named Martinez, approached, her notepad in hand. "Ben, we've got the guy in custody. He's unconscious, but the medics say he'll pull through. We'll run his prints and ID him back at the station. In the meantime, can you think of any reason someone might target your family? Any threats, unusual behavior, enemies?" Ben opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. His mind raced through every case he'd worked, every decision he'd made in his career. Being a cop wasn't a job that came without risks, and he'd faced his share of angry suspects and vengeful criminals. But no one stood out, no one seemed capable of bringing something like this to his doorstep. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing makes sense." Martinez nodded, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "We'll keep digging. For now, why don't you take your family somewhere safe for the night?" "We'll need a full statement in the morning," Ben agreed, though the idea of leaving his home unsettled him. It wasn't just a house, it was their sanctuary, the place where Ethan grew up, where laughter echoed through the halls on good days and where they weathered storms together as a family. And now, it felt tainted, invaded, like a stranger had walked through their memories and left something broken behind. Lisa drove them to her sister's house on the other side of town. The ride was silent except for the occasional sniffle from Ethan in the back seat. Ben stared out the window, his jaw tight, his mind churning with possibilities. Who was this man? And what had Ethan meant when he said the intruder was looking for something? When they arrived, Lisa's sister, Megan, greeted them with open arms, ushering them inside and offering tea and blankets. Ethan clung to his mother, his small frame shivering despite the warmth of the house. "I'll be right back," Ben said, kissing Lisa on the forehead before stepping outside. He needed air, space to think. He pulled out his phone and called Jenkins, who was still at the scene. "Any updates?" Ben asked, his voice low. "Not much," Jenkins replied. "The guy's prints aren't in the system, no idea on him either. We've found a few things in his pockets, an old key, some kind of list, but no wallet, no phone. It's weird, Ben. This guy doesn't seem like a typical burglar." "What kind of list?" "Don't know yet. It's just names and numbers, no addresses or context. We'll analyze it in the morning." Ben felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. A list. Was his name on it? Was Ethan's? "Keep me posted," Ben said before hanging up. He leaned against the porch railing, staring into the night. The quiet felt oppressive, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. He thought about Ethan's bravery, calling for help instead of freezing in fear. And then he thought about the intruder, about the calculated way he moved through their home. This wasn't random. It couldn't be. As he stood there, the pieces of the night slowly falling into place, one thought kept repeating in his mind, a chilling realization he couldn't shake. Whoever that man was, he hadn't come to steal. He had come for them. Ben stepped back inside the house, his mind still racing. Lisa was sitting on the couch with Ethan curled up beside her, his head resting on her lap. She ran her fingers gently through his hair, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and worry. Megan handed her a cup of tea and whispered something that Ben couldn't hear, but he could see Lisa nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan looked up when Ben entered. "Daddy," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "Why did that man come to our house? What did he want?" Ben crouched down in front of him, placing a hand on his son's knee. He wanted to tell him everything was fine, that it was all over, but the words felt like lies. Instead, he said, "I don't know yet, buddy. But I promise I'll figure it out. You don't have to be scared anymore. I'll keep you safe." Ethan nodded, but his eyes lingered on his father's, searching for reassurance. Ben hated the look of doubt and fear in his son's eyes, feelings a child his age should never have to know. He stood and looked at Lisa, who was watching him intently. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked her. She gently eased Ethan off her lap, and Megan quickly stepped in, offering to distract him with a game on her phone. Lisa followed Ben into the small kitchen, crossing her arms as she leaned against the counter. "What's going on, Ben?" she asked, her voice low but tense. "That man didn't just pick our house at random, did he?" Ben rubbed the back of his neck, unsure how much to say. "I don't know for sure, but it doesn't feel random. Jenkins said they found a list on the guy, names and numbers. We don't know what it means yet, but it could be connected to us." Lisa's face paled. "Connected how? Through your work? Did someone you were asked come after us?" "Maybe," Ben admitted, though the thought made his stomach twist. "But there's something else. Ethan said the man was looking for something. He wasn't just there to hurt us or take anything valuable. He had a purpose." Lisa's brow furrowed. "But what could he possibly want?" "There's nothing in the house that—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening. "Wait. You don't think this has anything to do with your dad's old stuff, do you?" Ben froze. His father's belongings. They were stored in a trunk in the attic, untouched since his death 5 years ago. His dad had been a private investigator, a man with a knack for uncovering secrets and digging into dangerous territory. Ben had never gone through the trunk, partly out of grief and partly because he wasn't sure he wanted to know what was inside. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "But it's the only thing in the house that stands out. I'll check it tomorrow, first thing." Lisa shook her head. "Tomorrow? Ben, what if there's something in there that explains all of this? What if it's the reason that man came after us?" "You can't wait," he sighed, knowing she was right. The thought of going back to the house made his skin crawl, but he had to know. "Okay," he said. "I'll go tonight. I'll grab Jenkins or someone else to come with me." Lisa grabbed his hand, her grip tight. "Be careful. I can't go through something like this again." "I will," he promised, pulling her into a brief but firm hug. "Stay here with Ethan. Don't let anyone in except me." Half an hour later, Ben was back in front of his house, his partner Jenkins waiting for him by the curb. The crime scene tape flapped in the breeze, and the house looked eerily quiet, as though it was holding its secrets tightly. "You ready?" Jenkins asked, his flashlight cutting through the dark. "Not really," Ben admitted, but he opened the door anyway. The house smelled faintly of disinfectant from the cleanup crew, but the shadows seemed heavier than before. Ben led Jenkins upstairs to the attic entrance, pulling down the creaky ladder. Dust rained down as he climbed into the cramped space, the beam of his flashlight revealing boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. The trunk sat in the far corner, untouched, its heavy padlock still intact. Ben crouched in front of it, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the key he'd kept hidden in his nightstand for years. He hesitated for a moment before sliding the key into the lock and twisting. The latch popped open with a metallic click, and Ben lifted the lid. Inside was a jumble of papers, old notebooks, and faded photographs. Everything smelled faintly of mildew and the past. Ben started sifting through the contents, his heart pounding as he uncovered documents from his father's old cases. Most were mundane, divorce investigations, missing persons, fraud cases, but then he found something that made him stop cold. A file labeled Westfield Case, Confidential. "Jenkins," Ben called down, his voice strained. "You need to see this." His partner climbed up, peering over Ben's shoulder as he opened the file. Inside were more photos, these ones far darker in tone. They showed a man, recognizable as the intruder from earlier, standing in front of a nondescript building. There were notes scrawled in the margins, references to something called the Harkins Group. "What the hell is this?" Jenkins muttered, flipping through the pages. Ben's father's handwriting was unmistakable, his notes sharp and meticulous. The file detailed surveillance, suspected criminal activities, and links to a shadowy organization Ben had never heard of. The deeper they read, the clearer it became, his father had been investigating something big, something dangerous. And now, it seemed, that danger had come to them. Jenkins frowned. This guy wasn't just some burglar. He's tied to this case. But why now? Why your family? Ben didn't have an answer. All he knew was that this was bigger than a random home invasion. His father's unfinished business had come back to haunt them, and if the file was any indication, it was far from over. Ben sat back on his heels, the weight of the file pressing on his chest like a physical force. The air in the attic felt heavy, thick with dust and something more, secrets long buried but never truly gone. The photographs, the notes, the references to the Harkins Group, it was all too much. He glanced at Jenkins, whose face mirrored his own unease. "Why would my dad have been looking into something like this?" Ben murmured, more to himself than his partner. He wasn't a cop. He didn't have the resources to take on whatever this is. Jenkins leaned closer, flipping through the remaining pages of the file. "Your dad might have stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to. Maybe he thought he could handle it on his own. Or maybe he knew he couldn't and left this behind for someone like you to figure out." The words sent a chill down Ben's spine. His father had always been a private man, his work rarely discussed at the dinner table. Ben had assumed it was to protect the family from the darker sides of his investigations. Now, he wondered if it had been something more, if his father had kept them in the dark to shield them from danger. As they pored over the file, a disturbing pattern emerged. The Harkins Group wasn't just some small-time operation. The notes suggested ties to corruption, human trafficking, and high-level financial crimes. It was an intricate web, and Ben's father had been pulling on one of the threads. The man who broke into their home wasn't just any criminal, he was part of that web, and he'd come looking for something his father had left behind. "What if this isn't everything?" Ben asked suddenly, his mind racing. "What if my dad hid more somewhere else?" Jenkins glanced at him. "You think there's another piece to this puzzle?" "I don't know," Ben admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But this guy went through our house like he knew exactly what he was looking for. And if he didn't find it, he's not going to stop." The thought made Ben's stomach churn. Ethan and Lisa were safe for now, but how long would that last? Whoever was behind this wouldn't just give up. If they thought his father had something important, they'd keep coming until they got it. Jenkins sighed, his expression grim. "We need to get this to Martinez. Let her team take a crack at it. This is bigger than the two of us." Ben nodded, though the idea of handing over his father's work felt wrong. His dad had trusted no one with this information, and now Ben understood why. But the stakes were too high to keep it to himself. They carefully packed the file back into the trunk, leaving the rest of the papers undisturbed. As they climbed down from the attic, Ben's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Lisa. Her voice was quiet, strained. "Ben, Ethan's asking for you. He's scared. He keeps saying the bad man is coming back." Ben's heart ached at the fear in her voice. "I'll be there soon," he promised. "Just keep him close. Don't let anyone in, not even the police, unless it's Jenkins or me." "Okay," she whispered. "Just hurry." He hung up, the knot in his stomach tightening. Ethan's fear was unfounded. The man who broke into their home might be in custody, but the danger was far from over. The Harkins Group was still out there, and if the file was any indication, they had the resources to find what they wanted, no matter who stood in their way. On the drive back to Megan's house, Ben couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror more often than necessary, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. Jenkins followed behind in his cruiser, his presence a small comfort. But the streets felt too quiet, the shadows too long. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath. When they arrived, Lisa met him at the door, her face pale but determined. "Ethan's in the guest room. He finally fell asleep, but it took hours. He kept saying he saw someone outside the window." Ben's chest tightened. "Did you see anything?" She shook her head. "No, but I closed all the curtains and locked every door. Megan's been keeping an eye on the security cameras." Ben nodded, his eyes scanning the street behind her. The neighborhood looked peaceful, but he knew better than to trust appearances. He stepped inside, his body tense, every instinct on high alert. Jenkins joined them in the living room, the file clutched under his arm. "We'll take turns keeping watch tonight," he said. "If they're bold enough to come after you again, we'll be ready." Ben appreciated the sentiment, but the truth was, he didn't feel ready. This wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was about protecting his family, unraveling a mystery that had been years in the making, and figuring out what his father had left behind. And the weight of it all was crushing. As the hours dragged on, the house remained quiet, but Ben couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He sat by the window, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. Lisa stayed nearby, her hand occasionally brushing his arm, a silent reminder that they were in this together. It wasn't until just before dawn that something happened. A faint sound, a car engine idling in the distance. Ben straightened, his eyes narrowing as he peered out the window. A dark sedan was parked a few houses down, its lights off, the driver barely visible. It didn't belong to any of the neighbors, and its presence sent a jolt of adrenaline through Ben's veins. He motioned to Jenkins, who joined him at the window. "You see that?" Ben whispered. Jenkins nodded, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Yeah. Stay here. I'll check it out." "No," Ben said firmly. "We go together." Jenkins didn't argue. They moved silently, slipping out the back door and cutting through the yards to approach the car from behind. The closer they got, the more suspicious it seemed. The windows were heavily tinted, the plates obscured by dirt. Ben signaled for Jenkins to cover him as he moved to the driver's side. He tapped on the window with his flashlight, his other hand on his weapon. "Please. Roll down the window." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the engine roared to life, the tires screeching as the car sped away. Ben barely had time to jump back as it tore down the street, disappearing into the early morning haze. Jenkins cursed under his breath. "They're watching you, Ben. This isn't over." Ben stared after the car, his fists clenched. He didn't need Jenkins to tell him that. Whoever they were, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And now, it was up to him to figure out what that was, before it was too late. The adrenaline from the encounter lingered long after the car disappeared. Ben and Jenkins stood in the cool dawn air, the silence around them now oppressive. The distant hum of the fleeing vehicle seemed to echo in Ben's mind. He knew this wasn't a random act of surveillance, it was calculated, a message. They weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. Jenkins broke the silence first. "We need to figure out who's pulling the strings, and fast. If they're bold enough to come this close, they're not just testing the waters, they're preparing to strike." Ben nodded, his jaw tight. His mind raced through the possibilities, trying to piece together the fragmented clues his father had left behind. There had to be more to the file. His father wasn't careless, and if he'd gathered evidence on something this dangerous, he would have ensured it was hidden securely. But where? They returned to the house, their movements cautious. Lisa was waiting for them at the door, her expression tense. She didn't need to ask what had happened, Ben's face said it all. She grabbed his arm, her voice low but urgent. "What now? Do we pack up and leave? Take Ethan somewhere safe?" Ben shook his head, though the thought had crossed his mind. "Running won't solve this. They'll find us wherever we go. We need to figure out what they're after and why my dad was involved." Lisa's eyes filled with worry, but she nodded, trusting his judgment. "Just promise me you'll be careful, Ben. Whatever this is, it's bigger than us." He squeezed her hand, the weight of that truth pressing down on him. He didn't want to admit how deep this ran, not to her, not to himself. But every step forward revealed a darker, more complex web than he'd imagined. Inside, Megan was still monitoring the security cameras. She glanced up as they entered, her brows furrowed. No sign of them coming back, but that car wasn't here by accident. Whoever they are, they know exactly where to look. Ben approached the monitor, studying the grainy footage of the sedan. He replayed the moments before it fled, his eyes narrowing at a faint glint near the back window. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. "Zoom in," he said, motioning to Megan. She adjusted the footage, enhancing the area as much as possible. The glint sharpened into a symbol, a small, almost imperceptible emblem on the rear windshield. It was circular, with a jagged design that looked like a broken chain. Jenkins leaned over his shoulder. "That mean anything to you?" Ben frowned. "No. But I'll find out." He stepped away, pulling out his phone to take a photo of the screen. As he did, his gaze drifted to Ethan, who was asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled up to his chin. His son's small, peaceful face was a stark reminder of what was at stake. Whoever these people were, they'd already gotten too close. He wouldn't let them take anything more. The rest of the morning passed in tense quiet. Ben and Jenkins pored over the contents of the file, searching for anything that might connect to the emblem on the car. Most of the notes focused on the Harkins group, their suspected operations, and a few cryptic mentions of a project called Phoenix Nest. The name was scrawled in his father's handwriting, underlined twice, but there were no details, just a series of coordinates that led to a wooded area outside the city. Ben traced the location on his phone's map. This doesn't make sense. If my dad was investigating them, why would he focus on some random patch of forest? Jenkins shrugged. Could be a meeting spot, a safe house, or a dead drop. Whatever it is, your dad thought it was important enough to document. Lisa entered the room, her arms crossed tightly. You're not seriously thinking about going there, are you? Ben, this could be a trap. I don't have a choice, he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. If this is connected to my dad's work, and to the people watching us, I need to know. If it's a trap, I'll deal with it. But I can't sit here and wait for them to make the next move. Lisa's expression softened, but her concern was clear. Then take Jenkins. Don't go alone. Ben nodded. I wasn't planning to. By the time they left, the sun was high in the sky, casting harsh shadows over the city streets. The coordinates led them to a narrow, unmarked road that wound through dense trees. The farther they drove, the quieter it became, until the only sounds were the crunch of gravel under their tires and the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. This place gives me the creeps, Jenkins muttered, his hand resting on his holster. Feels too quiet, Ben agreed but said nothing. His focus was on the GPS, which indicated they were less than a mile from the coordinates. When they finally arrived, they found themselves in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. At first glance, it seemed empty, but as they stepped out of the car, Ben noticed something odd, a metal hatch, partially obscured by leaves and dirt. Jenkins approached cautiously, his weapon drawn. What do you think? Underground bunker? Maybe, Ben said, kneeling to brush away the debris. The hatch was old, its surface rusted, but the lock on it was new, sturdy and freshly installed. This isn't random, Jenkins said, his voice low. Someone's been here recently. Ben's pulse quickened. He reached for the combination lock, but it didn't budge. Whoever had sealed it knew what they were doing. He stood and looked around, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than before. We need to get inside, Ben said. But not here, not now. It's too exposed. Jenkins nodded. We'll bring the right tools next time. For now, we get out of here and regroup. As they turned back toward the car, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving something, or someone, behind. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows stretching long and dark. Whatever secrets lay beneath that hatch, they were part of something far bigger than his father's investigation. And now, those secrets were waiting for him to uncover them. The drive back from the clearing felt heavier than the trip in, as though an invisible weight had settled over Ben and Jenkins. Neither spoke for the first 10 minutes. The tension between them thick with unanswered questions. The image of the rusted hatch stayed in Ben's mind, its presence an ominous reminder that this wasn't over. He kept glancing at the side mirror, half expecting to see headlights trailing them through the winding forest road. When they finally reached the main highway, Jenkins broke the silence. You realize whoever put that hatch there will know we found it. They'll be watching it now, maybe even laying a trap. I know, Ben said, gripping the wheel tighter. But we can't leave it alone. That hatch could be the key to everything, why my dad was targeted, why they came after my family. If we don't act, they'll stay one step ahead. Jenkins nodded but didn't look reassured. His hand hovered near his sidearm, his eyes scanning the horizon. We're not equipped for this kind of operation, Ben. This isn't a typical case. These people aren't playing by the same rules we are, Ben sighed, his thoughts racing. He knew Jenkins was right. They were walking into the unknown, and every step seemed to deepen the danger. But there was no turning back now. The stakes were too high. When they pulled into Megan's driveway, Lisa met them outside, her face pale. Something's wrong, she said quickly. Ethan. He's been saying strange things again. He keeps talking about a man in the window. Ben's stomach twisted. He hurried inside, where Ethan sat curled up on the couch, clutching a blanket. His wide eyes darted to the windows, as though he expected someone to appear at any moment. Ethan, Ben said softly, crouching down beside him. What did you see, buddy? Can you tell me? The boy hesitated, his little hands gripping the blanket tighter. The man from before, he whispered. The one who broke in. He was standing outside, looking at me. But when I told Aunt Megan, he was gone. Ben's heart raced. The man Ethan described was still in custody. He'd checked the records himself. But the boy's fear was real, and it sent a chill down Ben's spine. Either Ethan had seen someone else, or he was remembering something from the night of the break-in. Neither explanation offered much comfort. Jenkins entered the room, his expression grim. "We need to lock this place down. I'll do a sweep of the perimeter." Ben nodded, his mind spinning. He didn't want to scare Ethan further, but he couldn't dismiss the possibility that someone was watching them again. Whoever had sent that car earlier wasn't just lurking in the shadows, they were escalating. As Jenkins checked the yard, Ben sat with Ethan, trying to reassure him. Lisa hovered nearby, her arms crossed tightly. "This can't go on, Ben." Ethan's terrified. "I'm terrified. You need to figure out what's going on before this destroys us." "I'm trying," Ben said, his voice low but firm. "But this isn't just about us anymore. My dad left something behind, something dangerous. Until I figure out what it is, these people won't stop." Lisa's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint sound of Jenkins re-entering the house. "No sign of anyone outside," Jenkins reported. "But I wouldn't let your guard down. If they're watching, they're good at staying hidden." The hours dragged on, every creak of the house setting Ben on edge. Megan monitored the cameras while Jenkins stayed near the front door, his hand resting on his weapon. Lisa stayed close to Ethan, who eventually drifted off to sleep, his small body curled protectively around his blanket. As the night deepened, Ben's thoughts returned to the hatch. What lay beneath it? Why had his father documented the coordinates without leaving more clues? The name Phoenix Nest echoed in his mind, its meaning just out of reach. Whatever it was, it had to be connected to the Harkins group, and to the danger now circling his family. Around midnight, a faint noise outside snapped him out of his thoughts. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch, like someone stepping on gravel. Ben motioned for Jenkins, who immediately took position by the window. They exchanged a glance, both of them tense and alert. Ben crept to the front door, his movements deliberate. He placed his hand on the doorknob but didn't open it, listening intently. Another sound came, closer this time, a low, metallic scrape, like a knife against stone. His pulse quickened. Jenkins whispered, "Back door. They're trying to get in." Ben nodded, signaling for Jenkins to cover him. He moved toward the back of the house, his weapon drawn. The air was thick with anticipation, every step calculated. As he reached the kitchen, the sound came again, this time from the window. Someone was outside, testing the locks. Ben turned off the light, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. He positioned himself beside the window, his heart pounding. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. They wanted to be noticed. Then, without warning, the window shattered. Glass rained down as a gloved hand reached through, fumbling for the latch. Ben didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon, his voice firm and commanding. "Freeze. Please. Put your hands where I can see them." The intruder froze for a moment, then pulled back. Ben caught a glimpse of their face, a man, partially obscured by a ski mask. Their eyes locked for a split second, and Ben saw something he hadn't expected, fear. Then the man bolted, disappearing into the night. Jenkins appeared behind him, breathless. "Did you get him?" Ben shook his head, frustration boiling over. "He's gone. But he'll be back. They always come back." Jenkins swore under his breath, his gaze scanning the broken window. "This isn't random, Ben. They're testing us. Pushing to see how far they can go." Ben didn't respond. He knew Jenkins was right. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as the shattered glass crunched beneath his feet, he realized that the worst was yet to come. The broken window became a silent reminder of how close they were to losing control of the situation. Jenkins swept the yard again, his flashlight cutting through the shadows, but the intruder had vanished into the darkness. Ben stayed by the window, gripping the edge of the counter as he fought the sinking feeling in his chest. Every move they made felt like reacting to a game they didn't know the rules to. Lisa appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Is it safe? What happened?" Ben turned to her, his expression weary but determined. "Someone tried to break in. They ran before we could get them." Her eyes widened. "This is getting worse, Ben. We can't keep Ethan here. It's not safe anymore." "I know," he said softly, his voice cracking under the weight of her words. "But I can't protect him if I don't know what we're up against. Whoever these people are, they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper, her fear spilling out. "What if what they want is us? What if it's Ethan?" Ben didn't have an answer for that. The thought had crossed his mind more than once, and it terrified him. But he couldn't let that fear take over. Not now. He had to stay focused. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence, everyone too alert to sleep. Ben and Jenkins took turns watching the perimeter, their nerves frayed with each passing hour. By morning, the tension had settled into a dull ache in Ben's chest. He needed answers, and fast. After a quick breakfast, Ben pulled Jenkins aside. "We're going back to the hatch. There's something there we're missing, and we don't have time to wait. If they're watching us, they'll expect us to stay here and protect the house. We'll catch them off guard." Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. "We'll need backup." "I've got someone in mind," Ben said, pulling out his phone. He made a call to an old friend from the force, a tech specialist named Callum who owed him a favor. Within an hour, Callum was at the house, his gear in tow. "This the kind of job I think it is?" Callum asked, eyeing the tension in the room. "Worse," Ben admitted. "We need you to cover the house while we're gone. Watch the cameras, keep an eye on Ethan and Lisa. If anything happens, you let me know immediately." Callum nodded, his usual light-hearted demeanor replaced with a seriousness that matched the situation. "You got it." With Callum in place, Ben and Jenkins set out for the clearing. The drive felt longer this time, every turn of the road filled with an oppressive sense of dread. When they arrived, the forest was eerily still, the hatch just as they'd left it. But something was different. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, and the ground near the hatch was disturbed, as if someone had been digging. Ben's heart sank. "They've been here." Jenkins knelt to examine the disturbed earth. "Not long ago. Maybe last night?" They worked quickly, prying open the lock with tools Jenkins had brought. The metal creaked as the hatch swung open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase descending into the ground. A faint light flickered below, casting strange shadows on the walls. Ben took a deep breath, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "Stay sharp. We don't know what's down there." They descended cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder as they went, the faint hum of machinery growing louder. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room filled with outdated equipment. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and a large map covered one side, dotted with pins and handwritten notes. Jenkins moved to the map, his eyes narrowing. "This looks like some kind of tracking system. Look, these pins are all local." Ben scanned the room, his flashlight landing on a desk piled with papers. He sifted through them, his pulse quickening as he recognized his father's handwriting. There were notes about the Harkins group, mentions of Phoenix Nest, and cryptic references to a second phase. But what caught his attention most was a photo tucked into the stack, a grainy image of a boy standing in a park. Ben froze. The boy in the photo was Ethan. "Jenkins," he said, his voice tight. "Look at this." Jenkins stepped over, his face darkening as he saw the photo. "What the hell is this? Why is Ethan in their files?" Ben's mind raced. This wasn't just about his father's investigation anymore. Ethan was part of it, somehow. But why? And how had his father known? Before they could process the discovery, a loud clang echoed from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone was coming down the stairs. Ben and Jenkins exchanged a look, their weapons drawn as they moved into position. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint creak of the stairs. Then, a voice called out, a voice Ben recognized instantly. "Ben? Is that you?" Ben's grip on his weapon faltered as he turned toward the sound. Standing at the bottom of the stairs was a man he thought he'd never see again. It was his father. Ben's knees nearly buckled as he stared at the man standing in the dim light. His father, Jack, looked older, his face lined with stress and exhaustion. His hair had grayed significantly, and his clothes were disheveled, as though he'd been on the run. But it was unmistakably him, alive and standing right in front of them. "Dad?" Ben's voice cracked, disbelief flooding his senses. How is this possible? You're supposed to be dead?" Jack interrupted, his voice calm but tinged with urgency. "I know. That's what they wanted you to believe. But I had no choice. I had to disappear to protect you and Ethan." Jenkins stepped forward cautiously, his weapon still drawn. "Protect them from what? You've got a lot of explaining to do." Jack held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Lower the gun. I'll tell you everything, but we don't have much time. They'll figure out I'm here soon enough." Ben motioned for Jenkins to stand down, though his hand still hovered near his own holster. He stepped closer to his father, his emotions a swirling mix of relief, anger, and confusion. "What's going on, Dad? What is this place?" And why is Ethan in those files? Jack exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging. This is part of an old project I was working on, something I shouldn't have gotten involved in. It started as a government program to track dangerous individuals, but the Harkins group. They hijacked it. They turned it into something else, something darker. Ben frowned. What do you mean? What does Ethan have to do with this? Jack hesitated, his eyes flickering with guilt. The Harkins group wasn't just tracking people. They were experimenting, testing genetic markers, searching for anomalies. Ethan's mother, Sarah, volunteered for one of their studies years ago. She didn't know what they were really looking for. When Ethan was born, they flagged him. They think he's special, Ben. They think he's the key to something they've been chasing for decades. Ben's stomach churned. Special? What are you talking about? Jack shook his head. I don't know all the details. What I do know is that they'll stop at nothing to get to him. That's why I staged my death, to throw them off and buy you time. But they've found you now, and they're getting desperate. Jenkins interjected, his tone skeptical. If you knew all this, why didn't you warn your son? Why leave him in the dark? I didn't have a choice, Jack said, his voice rising. The less he knew, the safer he was. But now they're closing in, and we're out of options. Ben's mind raced, trying to process everything. His father's return answered some questions but raised 1,000 more. So what do we do? How do we stop them? Jack moved toward the map on the wall, pointing to a cluster of pins near the edge. This isn't just a tracking system, it's a blueprint for their next move. They're consolidating their resources, bringing everything to one location. If we can get there, we might be able to shut it down. But it won't be easy. They'll be expecting resistance. Jenkins crossed his arms. And where exactly is this location? Jack hesitated, then said, an abandoned facility in the next county. It used to be a research lab, but the Harkins group converted it into their operations hub. That's where they'll take Ethan if they get him. Ben's fists clenched. They're not getting him. Not now, not ever. Jack placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression heavy with regret. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this sooner, Ben. But now that you know the truth, we have to act fast. Before Ben could respond, the sound of tires crunching gravel echoed from above. Jenkins moved toward the stairs, his weapon at the ready. We've got company. Jack's face hardened. They've found us. We need to move. Now. Ben grabbed the files and photo from the desk, stuffing them into his jacket. The three of them ascended the stairs quickly, their breaths shallow as the noise outside grew louder. When they reached the surface, they saw several vehicles parked at the edge of the clearing, their headlights cutting through the trees. Men in dark tactical gear were fanning out, their movements precise and methodical. Ben counted at least 6 of them, heavily armed and scanning the area. One of them shouted, "We know you're here. Come out, and no one gets hurt." Jack cursed under his breath. They're not here to negotiate. We need to split up. Jenkins, take Ben back to the house. Protect Ethan. I'll draw them away. No way, Ben said firmly. I'm not leaving you again. You don't have a choice, Jack shot back. Ethan is the priority. If they capture him, it's over. Jenkins grabbed Ben's arm. He's right. Let's go. Reluctantly, Ben followed Jenkins, his heart pounding as they slipped into the woods. Jack stayed behind, creating a diversion by overturning a metal barrel and setting it ablaze. The fire roared to life, drawing the attention of the armed men. As Ben and Jenkins put distance between themselves and the clearing, the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. Ben's chest tightened, but he didn't look back. All he could do now was trust his father to hold them off, and pray they'd have a chance to finish what he started. The drive back to the house felt like an eternity, every second stretching into an unbearable weight. Ben gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles wide as he tried to focus on the road ahead. Jenkins sat in the passenger seat, scanning the dark woods for any sign of pursuit. The faint sound of gunfire still echoed in Ben's ears, his father's final words replaying in his mind, "Protect Ethan. If they capture him, it's over." When they reached the house, Lisa and Callum were waiting anxiously on the porch. Lisa ran to meet them, her face pale with worry. "What happened? Where's Jack?" Ben hesitated, unable to find the words. Finally, he said, "He stayed behind to buy us time. We don't know if he made it." Lisa's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. But there was no time to grieve. Callum interrupted, his voice tense. "We've got bigger problems." The cameras picked up movement in the woods. "They're coming this way." Ben nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll hold them off as long as we can." Jenkins, take Lisa and Ethan to the safe room. Callum, stay on the cameras and alert me to any changes. Jenkins didn't argue, ushering Lisa and Ethan into the fortified basement. Ethan clung to his mother, his wide eyes filled with fear. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What's going on?" Ben knelt down, forcing himself to stay calm for his son's sake. "It's going to be okay, buddy. Stay with Mom and listen to Jenkins. I'll come get you when it's safe." Ethan nodded reluctantly, and Jenkins led them away. Ben stood and turned to Callum, who was already glued to the monitor. "How many are there?" "Too many," Callum muttered. "At least 10, maybe more. They're surrounding the house." Ben grabbed a rifle from the cabinet and positioned himself near the front door. The tension in the air was suffocating, every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind amplified in his ears. Then, the first sign of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. Ben didn't wait. He fired a warning shot into the air, his voice ringing out. "I don't know who you are, but this is private property. Leave now, or I won't hesitate to defend my family." For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice called back, cold and calculating. "We're not here to hurt anyone. Just give us the boy, and this will all be over." Ben's blood ran cold. "Over my dead body." The response was a volley of gunfire, bullets slamming into the side of the house. Ben ducked behind cover, his heart racing as he returned fire. Callum shouted from the back room, "They're trying to breach the kitchen door." Ben sprinted through the house, barely making it in time to see two men forcing the door open. He took them down with two well-placed shots, but more were coming. The house was quickly becoming a war zone, and Ben knew they couldn't hold out forever. "Jenkins," he shouted into his radio. "Get them out of here. Take the back exit and head for the neighbor's property. I'll cover you." Jenkins' voice crackled back. "Understood. Stay safe, Ben." As the safe room door opened, Ben caught a glimpse of Lisa and Ethan hurrying out, their faces etched with fear. He turned back to the fight, determined to buy them as much time as possible. The attackers were relentless, their coordination suggesting military training. Ben held his ground, but the odds were against him. Just when he thought he couldn't hold them off any longer, a deafening explosion rocked the clearing. The attackers froze, momentarily stunned, as flames erupted from the woods. Out of the smoke emerged Jack, battered but alive, carrying what looked like a makeshift grenade launcher. "Miss me?" Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Ben couldn't believe his eyes. "Dad? How?" "No time for that," Jack interrupted, taking aim and firing another explosive round at the advancing attackers. "We've got to finish this." With Jack's unexpected arrival, the tide began to turn. Together, they forced the remaining attackers to retreat, their shouts echoing into the night as they fled into the woods. When the last of them disappeared, Jack slumped against the side of the house, breathing heavily. Ben ran to him, his emotions a mix of relief and disbelief. "Dad? I thought you were gone?" Jack gave a weak smile. "I'm tougher than I look." Before Ben could respond, a sound caught his attention, a faint beeping coming from one of the fallen attackers. He knelt to investigate, his heart sinking as he realized what it was, a tracking device. "They know where Ethan is," he said, his voice grim. "This isn't over." Jack's expression darkened. "Then we don't have much time. There's one last thing I didn't tell you, Ben. Something I hoped you'd never have to know." Ben frowned. "What are you talking about?" Jack hesitated, then said, "The reason Ethan is so important to them. It's because of me. I was part of their project, years ago. I thought I escaped it, but they've been watching me ever since. Ethan inherited something from me, something they want. And they won't stop until they get it." Ben stared at his father, his mind reeling. Before he could process the revelation, the sound of helicopters filled the air, their searchlights piercing through the trees. Jack grabbed Ben's arm, his voice urgent. "We need to move. Now." As the two of them ran toward the safe room, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined, and the fight to protect his son was far from over. The sound of helicopters grew louder, the low hum of their engines vibrating through the air as the searchlights swept over the house and trees. Ben's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. Every second counted now. His father's revelation had shaken him to the core, but there was no time for questions. The enemy was closing in. "Jack, what exactly are we up against?" Ben asked, his voice tight as they moved swiftly through the woods toward the neighbor's property. Jack didn't look back as he hurried, his face grim. "A lot more than we've seen. The Harkins Group controls more than just a few private military contractors. They've got eyes everywhere, Satellite surveillance, underground networks, you name it. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want. Ben clenched his fists. We can't let them have Ethan. We have to keep moving. The two of them reached the neighbor's property, where Jenkins, Lisa, and Ethan were waiting. Lisa's eyes were wide with panic, and Ethan clung to her side, his face pale and strained. Ben rushed to them, trying to steady his breath. "Is everyone all right?" Ben asked, his voice laced with urgency. "We're fine," Jenkins answered, his tone sharp. "But they're coming, Ben. The choppers are just the beginning. We've got to get to the old barn at the back of the property. It's our best shot." Ben nodded, but just as they turned to head in that direction, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and the unmistakable sound of an explosion echoed through the trees. The force of it knocked them off balance, and Ben felt the air rush from his lungs as they hit the ground. He looked up in horror to see a fireball rising from the clearing near the house. "Dad!" Ben shouted, panic flooding his chest. He scrambled to his feet, but Jack was already ahead of him, running toward the explosion. "No!" Ben yelled, but Jack didn't slow down. The helicopter lights grew brighter as they hovered above, and Ben could see a team of armed soldiers descending from the choppers on ropes. This wasn't just a search anymore, it was an assault. Ben and the others quickly took cover behind the thick trees, keeping low as they moved toward the barn. Jenkins and Lisa were ahead, carrying Ethan between them, while Jack continued his wild sprint, determined to reach the blast site. Ben's pulse raced. He knew he couldn't afford to chase after his father, not with the threat closing in from all sides. But there was a part of him, a deep, irrational need, to make sure his father was still alive, still fighting for their survival. "Ben, we have to keep going," Lisa hissed from behind him, tugging him gently by the arm. Her eyes were wide with terror, and Ethan clung to her, his small body trembling in fear. Ben nodded, reluctantly turning away from the blaze that was still licking at the sky. They reached the barn, where Jenkins quickly pushed open the rotting doors, ushering everyone inside. "Stay down," Jenkins instructed as they crouched low. "We need to figure out our next move." The barn was dark, the only light coming from the flickering torches they had set up earlier. Ben's mind raced as he watched the shadows dance around them. There was an unsettling quiet in the air, broken only by the sound of helicopters circling above. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. "We can't hide forever," Ben muttered under his breath. "We need to take the fight to them." Jenkins shook his head, eyes narrowed. "Not yet. Not until we know where they're coming from. We can't make a move without knowing their strategy." Ben bit his lip, frustration bubbling inside him. He wanted to fight back, to strike before they were overwhelmed. But his father's words echoed in his mind, "They'll stop at nothing to get Ethan." The reality of it hit him harder now. The Harkins Group wasn't just some shadowy organization. They were vast, and they had the resources to destroy anyone who got in their way. Lisa leaned toward him, her voice barely a whisper. "Ben. We have to protect Ethan. We can't let them turn him into something. A weapon. Whatever they want with him, we have to stop them." Ben nodded, his eyes scanning the barn's interior. He could see the fear in his family's faces, the uncertainty in their eyes, but there was one thing he knew for sure, he wasn't going to let them take his son. No matter what. Suddenly, a loud bang from the back of the barn made them all jump. Ben motioned for everyone to stay low as he crept toward the noise. He peered through the gaps in the barn wall, heart pounding in his chest. What he saw nearly made his blood freeze. A group of armed men were at the edge of the property, gathering around something that seemed to be glimmering in the moonlight. A large metal box, standing alone under the shadows of the trees. Ben's mind raced. It looked like a container for something, but what? Before he could think further, Jack's voice cut through the air, louder than anything Ben had ever heard. "Move. Now." Ben's heart skipped a beat. His father's voice was ragged and desperate, full of panic. He turned and rushed toward the door, but before he could take another step, a figure stepped into the barn from the back. It was Jack. But he was different. His clothes were singed, his face covered in soot, but it wasn't the physical damage that stopped Ben dead in his tracks. It was the way his eyes looked, empty, hollow, as if something was missing. Ben froze, his breath caught in his throat. "Dad?" Jack's lips curled into a slow, sinister smile. "You were always too trusting, Ben. You should have known. The Harkins Group. They're always one step ahead." Ben's heart lurched as the barn door slammed shut behind him. Jack took a step forward, the cold gleam in his eyes unmistakable. And then, Ben realized with horror, his father hadn't come to help them. He'd come to finish what was started. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen, staring at his father. The man before him, his father, wasn't the same person who had fought to protect them earlier. There was no warmth in his eyes, no sense of familiarity. It was as if the man standing there was someone else entirely, a stranger wearing Jack's face. "Dad? What's happening?" Ben's voice cracked, disbelief thick in his tone. He stepped back slowly, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. Jack didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his expression cold and calculating. "You were always so naive, Ben. Always thinking you could protect your family, keep them safe. But there's a bigger game at play here, and you're just a pawn in it." Ben felt his stomach twist. "No. You're not him. This isn't you." But Jack's smile didn't falter. It wasn't the warm smile Ben had grown up with, the smile that had comforted him after a bad day, or reassured him during a stormy night. This one was empty, predatory, and the more Ben stared, the more it unsettled him. "Don't you see? They've been watching us for years. They know everything about you, about Ethan. The reason I've been so careful, so distant. It wasn't to protect you. It was because I had no choice." Jack's voice was soft, almost apologetic. But Ben could hear the underlying menace beneath every word. Lisa's voice cut through the tension. "Ben, don't listen to him." She pulled Ethan closer, shielding him with her body. "We need to get out of here now." Ben didn't move. His gaze never left Jack, who had begun to pace slowly, as if savoring every moment. "I didn't want this for you, Ben. I didn't want you to get involved. But it's too late now. Ethan's destiny was sealed the moment he was born. And I'm the one who led you all to this." Ben felt the weight of Jack's words, the realization crashing over him like a wave. His father wasn't just a victim, he had been complicit in this all along. He had been a part of the Harkins group, had been using them for his own gain, all while pretending to be the protective father and grandfather. It was a bitter pill to swallow. "You never had a chance, Ben," Jack continued, his voice almost too calm. "Ethan's power, the one they've been hunting for. It's a gift and a curse. But it's not your choice. They will use him, whether you like it or not." Ben's mind raced, his thoughts a blur. Everything he had thought he knew about his family, about his father, seemed to collapse in on itself. Jack had been a part of this monstrous organization all along. It wasn't just the Harkins group after them, it was Jack himself, manipulated, corrupted, or maybe even willing to betray them for something he thought was more important. "Stop it," Ben said, his voice suddenly firm. "This isn't you. I don't know who they've turned you into, but I'm getting my son out of here. You can either help us or get out of the way." Jack's gaze softened for the briefest moment, a flicker of something human crossing his face. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold indifference. "You can't protect him, Ben. You're out of your depth. You've always been out of your depth." The door behind Ben slammed open, and Jenkins appeared, his face pale but determined. "Ben, we've got a problem. The helicopters, there are more of them coming." Ben's eyes widened. The time for hesitation had passed. "We don't have much time," he said, turning to Jack one last time. "I won't let you do this. I'll stop you, even if it means I have to do it alone." Jack didn't flinch. He stood there, silent, as Ben ran past him, rushing toward the back door where Lisa, Ethan, and Jenkins were waiting. But just as Ben reached the doorway, Jack's voice stopped him cold. "Don't think you can escape it, Ben. The truth will always catch up with you." Ben hesitated, his back to his father, but he didn't turn around. "Maybe it will," he said quietly, "but not today." With that, Ben sprinted outside, pushing past the burning questions, the rising anger, and the cold knot of fear in his stomach. He had no answers, only a need to protect his son, to get them all out alive. The barn was just the beginning of their fight. As they moved through the woods, Ben felt the weight of the pursuit closing in. The helicopter's lights swept across the trees, their search for Ethan intensifying. But Ben didn't stop. He couldn't. Ethan was his priority now. The boy had no idea what he had inherited, what the world was willing to do to get their hands on him, but Ben was determined to shield him from it. No matter the cost. The group reached the edge of the property, where they could see the neighbor's truck waiting. Jenkins had already hotwired it, and Lisa quickly ushered Ethan into the back seat. Ben didn't hesitate. He jumped into the driver's seat, his mind focused on one thing only, getting them to safety. As they drove, the world outside seemed to blur, the threat still looming, but for the first time in what felt like days, Ben allowed himself to breathe. He had his family. He had Ethan. And for now, that was enough. The pursuit would continue, the Harkins group would regroup, and Jack's betrayal would linger in the back of his mind. But they had survived, this time. Ben glanced back at his family, at Lisa and Ethan, and a small, quiet promise formed in his heart. He would protect them. No matter what it took. They hadn't won yet. The battle was just beginning, but they weren't out of the fight. Not by a long shot. And as the headlights of the truck cut through the dark night, Ben knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all his father, take his son away from him. The end was just the beginning. As the truck sped down the narrow, winding road, Ben's mind kept drifting back to the horrible truth about his father. Jack, the man who had always been his hero, the man he had looked up to for years, had been hiding a dark secret. He wasn't just the devoted father and grandfather Ben had always believed. No, Jack had been a part of something far more sinister, something that had put their lives in constant danger. The Harkins group had been pulling the strings, using Jack as a pawn, and now they were after Ethan, Ben's son. Ethan, who had been born into this nightmare, was now at the center of a dangerous web. Ben's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The road ahead was unclear, filled with uncertainties and looming dangers, but he was determined to protect his family, to keep Ethan safe from the people who would stop at nothing to exploit him. He glanced at Lisa, who was sitting beside him, her eyes locked on the road ahead, her face pale but resolute. Ethan, too, was quiet in the back seat, his small face pressed against the window as he stared out into the night. Lisa's hand rested on his arm, her touch grounding him. "We'll get through this, Ben. We have to." He nodded, though doubt still gnawed at him. The Harkins group was a ruthless organization. They had resources, power, connections that reached far beyond what he could ever imagine. He wasn't sure how long they could keep running, how much longer they could stay ahead of their pursuers. But one thing was certain: they couldn't give up. Ben's eyes flicked back to Ethan in the rearview mirror. His son's face was pressed against the window again, but this time, there was something different in his expression. A quiet sadness, a knowing beyond his years. Ethan was too young to understand the full weight of the situation, but he knew enough to sense the danger. Ben could see it in the way his son's small hands gripped the edge of the seat, his body tense, as if waiting for something, anything, to happen. "We'll get through this," Ben whispered to himself, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "We have to." Suddenly, a flash of light appeared in the distance, growing brighter with each passing second. Ben's heart raced as he squinted against the glare. It was another helicopter. They were closing in again. "Lisa, get ready," Ben said urgently, his foot pressing harder on the accelerator. "We need to lose them." But the sound of the chopper's blades grew louder, and Ben's pulse quickened. They were still too close. Then, without warning, a shadow loomed in front of them, another vehicle, pulling up fast, cutting off their escape. Ben slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just inches from the other car. A man in tactical gear stepped out, his gun raised. "Get out of the truck," he ordered, his voice cold and harsh. Ben's stomach dropped. This was it. They were surrounded. But just as the man took a step forward, a shot rang out from the woods. The soldier dropped to the ground, unconscious, as another figure appeared from the shadows. It was Jack. Ben's heart skipped a beat as his father moved swiftly, dispatching the remaining soldiers with ease. There was no hesitation, no sign of doubt. Jack had made his choice. "You're not taking my family," Jack said, his voice a mix of resolve and something else, something that had been buried deep within him all along. Ben wasn't sure if it was redemption or defiance, but in that moment, Jack wasn't just the man who betrayed them. He was still Ben's father. The battle was far from over, but Ben realized something in that instant: family, no matter how broken, was the key to survival. Together, they could face the storm ahead. And they would.